Hello and welcome to another video of the tutorial series on the 4-player SCILL Unreal SDK. In this part we want to have a look at how to authenticate your players so that they can only take actions in the SCILL API that they are allowed to take, like claiming only rewards of their own and not of other players. SCILL is not providing an authentication mechanism itself. It expects every request from your users to come with an access token as a parameter. That means that you need to implement user authentication yourself and provide every connected user with a token. But this also means that you have the freedom to integrate any authentication with SCILL so that you can build on your current mechanisms. First, we will have a look at how to authenticate as a user in general with SCILL. Based on this, we will take an existing authentication with Valve's Steamworks SDK and use it to generate an authentication token for your user in a proper way. All this will be done in the Action RPG example by Epic Games for the Unreal Engine 4, since we have used it in the tutorials on the SCILL SDK for Unreal before. Make sure to either follow the tutorials or download the sample from SCILL's GitHub repositories. In order to test our project, you will later need to install the Steam client on your machine and create a Steam account if you do not already have one. This diagram in the SCILL developer documentation shows how the SCILL client can be agnostic of your authentication. The client app waits for a user ID or session that it has with your client backend and identifies it as a specific user and sends that to the client backend. The client backend now adds your SCILL app's API key and sends both to the Authentication API of SCILL. This returns an access token that you can then send back to your client app. Before sending the Generate Access Token action to the Authentication API, the client backend should first check whether the client app can take actions on behalf of a given user. At this point, you need to add some logic to your client app and client backend in order to properly authenticate the player. Generally, there are two ways to authenticate a user for a game. Use your own self-hosted authentication service or use an external authentication service. In self-hosted authentication, you can simply let your player send his credentials to your server to check them against your own authentication database. If it matches, the player is authenticated. The check would be done by any trusted source, in most cases your client backend. The client app in return gets a user access token that it can use to authenticate itself at your client backend in this session. Only if that token is valid, the client backend shall send the Generate Access Token call and receive the access token needed to make requests on the SCILL API. While this works very well if you own the credentials of your users, this cannot be done if you use an external authentication service like Steam. Steam will need to check three things: if the user can be trusted, but also if your application can be trusted, and if the user has given your application all the permissions that your application requests. So to act on behalf of a Steam user, you will have to also provide an app ID and an API key for most calls. Authenticating a Steam user with your application can be done in several ways. For this tutorial, we take advantage of an authentication through the Steam client on the user's device. The Unreal client will act as though it was started by the Steam client, and so it already has a session with the Steam API through the running Unreal client. We use that session to authenticate the Unreal client with the Steam service. On our trusted game server, we can now test if the session is valid, and if so, we generate the access token for SCILL. To accomplish this kind of authentication, we will use the online subsystem of Unreal Engine 4. This is an interface that abstracts the usage of any kind of online services, identity providers, stores, friends, sessions, and so on. The Steam Online Subsystem is one of its implementations and is deployed with the Unreal Engine as a plugin. You can simply enable it in the plugin settings of your project. Search for the Online Subsystem and Online Subsystem Steam plugins in the plugin browser of your project and enable them. After that, you have to close your project in the Unreal editor. You do not need to restart it yet. First, we will open the default engine.ini of your project and add these lines of code. They are copied and pasted from the Online Subsystem documentation of the Unreal Engine. Note that although this documentation says that you need to install the Steamworks SDK, you do not need to do that currently. Epic Games takes care of providing the correct libraries together with each version of the engine since some releases. Once you have done that, you can reopen your project. With these settings, you do not need to have a developer's account with the Steam service. The provided Steam Dev App ID is shared among all developers and you can use it to test many of its endpoints. Most importantly for us, the user authentication. For this example, this is just fine, but for your own game you will need to create a proper app ID on the Steamworks page before shipping. In order to work with the online subsystem from blueprints, we will need to either use the already exposed blueprint calls, use a third-party library, or write some extra C++ code. In this tutorial, we want to use blueprints only, so we need to take care of that. You can either write the small blueprint library yourself, or you can use the plugin in the sample project on the GitHub of SCILL. One of these functions, the getOSSUserID, does nothing more than just returning the platform-specific user ID. In our case, the Steam ID. The other function returns whether a user is properly signed in or not. Once we have everything set up, we can finally start adjusting our blueprints. Start the Unreal Editor and open your SCILL player controller and navigate to the event in the event graph that is called on the game server to generate an access token. Here we will add a call to isUserLoggedIn and provide it with the index of the current player controller. If this returns true, we use the Steam ID of that player to generate the access token for SCILL. So now to test this code, you will need to start your Steam client and log in. Once done, you can go to the Play in Editor button in the Unreal Editor and click the small triangle next to it. Here you choose to play in a standalone game. This is necessary because your executable needs to act as if it was started by an authenticated Steam client. Now once we logged in, you will have an access token to the SCILL API for the Steam ID that you are logged in with on the Steam client. That's all you have to adjust in your blueprints in order to properly test if a user is signed in. You can change the used online subsystem implementation to whatever subsystem you would like to use. Or you can write your own authentication and just replace the test for the logged-in user with a call to your API. I hope this video helped you setting up your authentication in your own Unreal Engine game using SCILL. You might want to read more about the online subsystem interface in the Unreal Engine as well as the Steamworks SDK in order to get started with the Steam authentication. Implementing these techniques to properly check if a user is signed in on your game server and generate an access token for SCILL is the easier step here. I wish you a great rest of your day and take care, bye.